Um, okay, I think we are going to make a start now because we've got quite a packed afternoon and in fact a very packed 1 hour. Just to introduce myself, my name is Admos. I'm an academic here at the University of Manchester's Global Development Institute. I am going to be chairing this webinar today, which is focused on the African Cities Research Consortium. We are going to be discussing how the Africa Cities Research Consortium and its international partners is planning to tackle the complex political, systemic problems in some of Africa's growing urban areas. And your presence here this afternoon will help us to deepen our understanding of the things that we are hoping to investigate. It's great to see so many of you here today for this introduction. And because we've got a lot of ground to cover, we have decided on a very simple format. We're going to start things off shortly with a presentation from the Africa Cities CEO, who is Professor Diana Mitlin, after which we also have inputs on research and uptake from Professor Sam Hickey, who is also from the Global Development Institute, and Martin Atela, who is the research program manager at the Partnership for Action for African Social and Governance Research based in Nairobi. After that, we will open the discussion up for a question and answer session. So if you have any questions, I'm going to ask you this afternoon to put them in the chat because there's so many of you and it's often that very few will get to speak. But if we have got the questions in the chat, we can capture those. And I will endeavor in my role as a chair to make sure that any questions you put in the chat, we'll put them to the panel afterwards. There is a lot of people on the webinar. So I would like to ask you to please mute yourself as we are just about to start. That helps us a great deal because then there is not that feedback which can disturb the flow of the discussions. Just to let you know as well that we will be recording proceedings and we will make the video available afterwards for all those people who have not been able to attend this afternoon because of other commitments that they might have or because there are technical challenges. So this will be available. So without wasting any further time, I would like now to invite Professor Diana Mitlin to start off this presentation, talking to us about how this African Cities Research Consortium and its international partners is planning to tackle these problems in some of the growing urban areas of Africa. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you, Admos. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, Admos, and thank you, audience. There are not many advantages to Zoom, but one is the ease with which we can reach out beyond the Pacific locality in which we're in. Another is very much the chat function. We can pick up, as Admos has already said, the issues that are of concern to you, and also anything that you think, any answers. We're interested in your answers, not just your issues. And as we start to develop our work going forward, you may see in the very near future blogs that pick up some of the things that you flagged, because I don't anticipate that we will get through everything today. So we really just are aspiring to give you a little bit of a flavor for what we hope to achieve. I'm going to talk a little bit about urban challenges. I'm going to talk about the ambition of DFID, now FCDO, who are providing funding and who catalyzed the consortium in a very real way. And I'm going to talk about the urban opportunities as we understand them. I'm then going to pass to Sam Hickey, one of my colleagues in Manchester. Admos has already introduced him. And then Sam will pass on to Martin Atela from Pascal in Nairobi, who, as Admos said, is Interim Uptake Director. So the aim of the research consortium, as in the bid documentation that we responded to, was very much to produce new knowledge and evidence on African cities. Let me come back to the detail of this. I think for me, the challenges of African cities are really summed up in this picture. This is a picture of tenements from Nairobi. Martin, I'm sure you know them well. And these buildings are really quite extraordinary because they cost about $360,000 to build, one block, maybe 9, 10 stories, maybe 14 rooms on each floor, communal services, water, sanitation, often poor construction quality. The payback on these buildings is about 4 years. So incredibly rapid return on investment. The people who live in there have moved there because they wish to move away from shacks and informal settlements. And they pay something like 40% of their income. This particular set of blocks was close to an industrial area, so it has a lot of informal industrial workers. They pay maybe 40% of their income. So there is a real challenge, a challenge that talks to what is the quality of life that people are experiencing. I think part of that challenge goes to long-standing work that my colleagues at the International Institute for Environment and Development have been working on for many years, a challenge to understand the ways in which urban poverty and inequality are being created and being maintained. There has been quite a strong narrative in development studies and the international development community that urban poverty is a less significant issue. I don't want to speak about the relative significance of urban vis-a-vis rural, but it is clear that there are considerable dimensions of disadvantage in urban areas that need to be addressed going forward if African cities are to achieve, are to be able to offer a vibrant, prosperous life for their citizens. So this particular picture highlights to me the very poor housing conditions, and it also highlights the challenges of urban basic services and the high cost of basic services. And more recently, we can see agencies such as the World Bank recognizing the challenge of high service costs in the African urban centers. But it's more than just the high cost of services. It's also the very poor quality of services. And I see from Admos's narrative about the chat, which I haven't yet had a chance to look at, that we may well get some questions around that. So this diagram relates to some work that I was doing with the World Resources Institute. And it really highlights the fact that not only are services poor, but the ways in which we've come to understand those challenges are lacking. So in the case of water, which is highlighted by this graph, the Joint Monitoring Programme don't highlight the intermittency of water supplies. I mean, you see here that in 2 informal settlements in Kampala and Lagos, bright red because there's no water in this case, no piped water in those settlements. You see in Maputo, another African city, that 6 hours for 7 days a week only. Now that creates big challenges, of course, depending on what sanitation system you're using, depending on how who is collecting water, how you're collecting water, how you're integrating the collection of water with your daily life. So we have major challenges there. I understand that the chat has also picked up the challenge of informal economies. In many African cities, we have over 80% of employment being in the informal sector. A lot of that is around services, highlighted here by a cafe advertising football matches from Manchester, as well as other urban centres, but also the kind of spaza shops that you see across many informal settlements. So real challenges around employment options. And of course, some of the people who face the most disadvantageous employment options are women living in informal settlements with very high responsibilities in terms of social reproduction, unable to challenge the gender discrimination they face inside the household and beyond the household. So big challenges around the informal sector, and already a recognition in the literature that one of the challenges is the very weak links between a very small formal sector and an informal sector. So the kind of triggers that have been important in the Asian context are not present in the context of Africa. I think one of the other challenges that we will reflect on, I'll say a little bit more about this when I mention our cities, is the challenge of fragility, risk, and vulnerability. This is a picture from Dar es Salaam. It's a few years old now. I think it was taken in 2015. And it shows a woman explaining to me about the recent history of eviction they'd faced. So we recognize the need to reflect on future of cities, on the development trajectories of cities already in fragile and conflict affected states, who in many cases have large numbers of citizens who've been displaced from war. We recognize that urban populations include refugees and some of the more vulnerable groups, among urban citizens. But we also recognize these long histories of displacement. So conflict and violence is not only present in fragile and conflict affected states, but many other cities also face those challenges, especially for the most low income citizens who are unable or have limited capacity to protect themselves. And the new challenges, of course, relate to the climate emergency. So the rationality for this eviction was to protect a floodplain. People were being moved back to protect a floodplain. But in fact, they've been shifted way back beyond the original ambition to create a reserve. And in part, they were pushed back because of contestation that goes on over land. And I don't think I need to say much more about that, because we know land is at the heart of wealth, asset accumulation, and urban opportunities for some, too frequently at the exclusion of opportunities for others. So the ambition of this research consortium is to produce new knowledge and evidence on African cities as systems, to lead to the development of and investment in economic development and poverty reduction policies and programs. We have here a bunch of pretty skeptical looking Malawian children from Lilongwe, who clearly are wondering if we can take on the development challenge that they seek. In order to address this challenge, and I think for me, the objective that I've just read out really reflects FCDO's belief that there is a better way of doing urban development. Its ambition to really craft that way, an ambition that I think we at the Global Development Institute and the partners who joined with us recognized was very timely. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the partnerships that we've got and the cities in which we'll work. And then I just want to end, before I pass on to Sam, to talk about the research strategy with a reflection on COVID. So we've brought together a consortium of agencies that we believe can begin to take on some of these challenges. So we have colleagues from the University of Manchester, and particularly the Global Development Institute, and a research centre that is focused on political settlements and using the framework of political settlements to understand the ways in which elites behave, the developmental ambitions they have and those they don't have. And we're joined particularly in our academic knowledge by UNU Wider, who add economic expertise, and the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. We've really addressed the need to be very practical, to think about shifting from the academic discourse and research methodologies into policy by drawing in expertise from IIED, from ODI, the Overseas Development Institute, and PASCAL, the Partnership for African Social and Governance Research. And we are trying to be very grounded in the work that we do, to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that research is not only about pushing forward the frontier of knowledge, but doing that in a way that makes a real difference on the ground. So we're joined by Shack Slum Dwellers International, by ICLEI's Africa office, and by the International Rescue Committee. We're working in 13 cities, planning to work in 13 cities. They're outlined on this map. I don't want to spend so much time talking about those cities, but really to say that we're working in them because we recognize that in those cities, in some shape or form, they are the foundations for urban reform. we recognize that one of the reasons why it is a particularly timely moment to think about doing this research program is because there has been, in some cases for decades, but a very small group working for decades, but a group of African-based researchers and research agencies who have wanted to challenge the urban disadvantage, who have recognized that there are big development challenges in urban areas and sought to work on those challenges. So we believe, by we, I mean myself, Manchester, our broader partnership, that we have selected cities that really offer an opportunity to work with a really grounded coalitions who are pushing for some kind of positive change in those locations. And we feel that among some of the slightly more grey-haired end of the spectrum, people like me, we now have a younger cadre of professionals, of community leaders, of academics who share that ambition to redefine the trajectory of urban development in Africa. I think it would be, Admos, if I could just take a couple more minutes, it would be inappropriate to leave without a little bit of reflection on the particular moment, entirely coincidental moment that we find ourselves. So what COVID-19 demands is an urban reset. 95% of cases, we estimate, UN Habitat estimate, are in urban areas. The health crisis associated with has catalyzed an economic crisis, as lockdowns have prevented people who are already vulnerable because of low pay being unable to work as they worked before. So the challenges are even more clearer. New agencies and individuals who did not previously give attention to urban areas are now very conscious of the need to give attention. And the people who are struggling at all levels in cities, be they large enterprises or small enterprises, informal settlements, or simply families trying to manage, those needs have become ever more acute. I'm sharing a slide from one group working in Mutare, an informal settlement in Nairobi in Kenya. And it gives a little bit of the flavor of what organized citizens have been able to do, to come together, to document the situation they face, to identify with local government safe isolation places, and to begin to think about how to build out of that vulnerability to a more secure place with, we hope, lessons for a much broader set of catalytic urban reform. So I'm going to stop now, having given you hopefully a little bit of a flavor for what we hope to do, and pass over to Sam Hickey. Sam.
Thanks a lot, Diana. I wasn't sure what it meant to be Diana's deputy when taking on this role, but it seems now that Diana gets all the great big picture stuff and I get to bore people with the concepts on it. So with due apologies for this, this is the way in which we're going to try and generate new and we hope compelling insights into the types of problems that you've identified in the chat. And to start to identify ways of working on them that are informed by political economy analysis, which underpins this framework. So there's three broad aspects to our conceptual framework, one of which is around power and its interplay with institutions at the national and city level. The second of which is around systems. Many of you in the chat have drawn attention to the failure of these systems to adequately deliver goods and services. And we think all of this comes to life. The politics and the developmental prospects for African cities really comes to life within what we're calling domains. And what I want to do is to run you through each of these different levels of the framework and suggest how they might interact. And also recognising that there's a lot that matters for African cities that falls outside of this framework. We know that African cities are embedded within transnational contexts that involve forms of geoeconomics and geopolitics, that they're affected by shocks, whether environmental, economic or health, as Diana has just pointed out. But what we're hypothesising is that these things become real when they're fed through patterns of power relations within national, city and local level political settlements. And that's the way in which we will explore those broader factors. So it's a new framework, but as Diana's pointed out, we have used some of these concepts before within the Effective States and Inclusive Development Research Centre. So we have some confidence that the political settlement and domains can give us some traction here. So what do we mean by some of these terms? So by national political settlements, we're referring to a concept which goes beyond the formal institutions of governance, and it helps us to understand the forms of power relations that determines whether or not these institutions work, or the ways in which they function and for which groups they function effectively for. Political settlements can be defined by our research director, Tim Kelsall, as an agreement or common understanding amongst powerful groups about the basic rules of the game. And once these basic rules of the game provide minimally acceptable benefits to elites, then you can prevent a fall into conflict or disorder. So it's a concept that has attraction in relation to both conflict and political order. And we have cases in the centre that will be unsettled, such as Somalia, and the lack of safety and security in cities like Mogadishu reflects the lack of a settlement. But we know that elsewhere we'll still find violence, and sometimes that's due to the enforcement of the settlement in places like Nairobi, where the lack of security is directly linked to the establishment of broader political orders. We think that a couple of things matter in particular about political settlements. We want to identify how concentrated power is around a political leadership. That can tell us whether there's a long-term vision, whether governing coalitions are capable or not of delivering on their commitments. We want to understand the social foundations of political settlements. Which groups really matter? The social identity of groups around race, ethnicity, gender, class, and income. Which groups are organised and powerful enough that ruling groups need to respond to them and shapes their incentives to respond. And we think cities are going to be really important to understand how political settlements function. They play particular roles within maintaining political settlements. They're central to the strategies of political survival and elite accumulation of ruling elites. In terms of accumulation, for example, rent generation around land speculation. And in terms of political survival, cities are key to delivering votes and legitimacy for ruling coalitions. Central often in terms of having large oppositional groups, as we've seen recently in Kampala, Addis and other cities within our centre. But we don't think it's all about incentives. We think that ideas will also matter. In the chat, someone said the power of westernized ideas around cities and modernity. And we think we've seen this in play very powerfully, that the ideas which underpin the rules of the game often position African cities on an unrealistic trajectory of modernity, often in ways that are entwined with interests, as we've seen around mega infrastructure investments to achieve Dubai-like status. So the national political settlement really matter, but we also recognise that cities have their own logics, their own balance of power that we'll need to recognise in terms of how cities are governed, the role of municipal authorities and sub-city authorities, and the relationship between city government and national government. And we'll also need to understand the social foundation of power within cities, around which groups have power, whether or not groups from informal settlements, women's groups, low-income groups are able to mobilise and make themselves relevant to those in power will matter here. And we'll also be bringing into play some of the literature on the everyday politics of urban life in sub-Saharan Africa to make sure we can join up our higher level elite analysis with what's happening on the ground. That's the sort of political economy aspects to it. We also look at city as systems, and these are the vertical boxes you can see going down your screen with names like water, land, transport, energy. Now in the urban studies literature, the term city as systems has usually been used to frame cities as complex, integrated human-dominated systems with metabolic properties based on stocks and flows, which enable economic activity and social reproduction. And we do want to maintain the significance of the materiality of cities to our analysis, but we want to add to that the importance of social and economic systems as well, and non-material as well as material flows of services and goods. So we'll be looking at health and education as well as things like energy, water and sanitation. And we don't see these as given systems, as technocratic entities, but rather as being highly politically determined and contested, shaped by particular histories, colonialism being the obvious one in terms of the type of spatial planning, for example, that exists in cities like Dar and Harare, and also particular geographies. Our aim here is not to produce in-depth studies of particular systems, but rather to look at them as being related to the wider political settlements. And we'll be particularly interested in how multiple systems come together and how systems failures across multiple systems create particular problems in what we're calling domains. So domains are our third elements, and this is to help us get beyond the problem of thinking about African cities in a very sectoral way, which has limited greatly the relevance of the responses that have been made to urban development challenges in Africa and more broadly. So domains incorporate multiple sectors that can be defined as areas of power, policy and practice that are relevant to the solution of particular problems. And they're constituted by actors, political, bureaucratic, private, professional, popular actors that seek to claim authority and rights over a particular field, which could be housing or land or informal settlement upgrading. And they adopt various strategies to ensure that their ideas around governance and how resource allocation should take place within the sector, how rights should be allocated, predominates by forming epistemic communities, by undertaking active programs of direct activism and programs of policy reform. And these domains are highly politicized, both for the reasons I've identified, but also because they again play roles in sustaining particular political settlements. Some of these will deliver rents to ruling elites at city level, others will deliver legitimacy. And we've seen city authorities engage in programs of, for example, Eyob Gebremariam's work in Addis Ababa has shown how youth groups who can potentially destabilize political settlements have become new domains of activity around distribution of handouts, and employment schemes have been geared around solving particular or attempting to solve particular political problems. So our hunch is that the most complex and intractable problems in African cities will be located within these domains and relate to the ways in which systems function and how both of these relate to wider national political settlements, and that reform efforts will need to be calibrated to the configurations of power at each of these levels. And a good example, which leads on to what Martin will be talking about, is from work that SDI were involved in Mukuru around the recent decision to upgrade an informal area and to improve systems there in 2017, which only took place when the social foundations of the settlement began to shift after the Moi era, before which informal settlements were deeply entrenched in rent-seeking activities where residents had to deliver rents to local officials and slumland was gifted to powerful clients of the ruling coalition. But once informal settlements become more important politically in the 2000s, and once coalitions of researchers and local activists begin to put together research on life in informal settlements, it becomes possible to put pressure on ruling elites to adapt their approach to informal settlements. So moving on to what this means in terms of how we will move forward with the next slide. I think that's you, Diana. And building up to Martin's input. So we're in stage one. We have 3 stages to our work. And in the inception phase, which has been going on since October, we've been trying to put the conceptual framework and the broader partnership together. We hope that from April we'll move into phase 2, and we will operationalise the framework in all 13 cities with a view to offering a deeper understanding of complex problems and identifying priority problems to work on in the 3rd phase. And the 3rd phase is where ACRC becomes a very different type of research centre to ones we've previously been involved in at Manchester, I think. We'll narrow down the range of cities to between 5 and 8. And we will undertake in-depth action research with a view to not just identifying solutions, but actively formulating and working with other actors to try and push towards their implementation, particularly drawing on SDI's theory of change. And we will have Beth Chiketwe-Beatty working with us as the implementation director throughout this phase, and drawing on SDI's knowledge of how reform coalitions can be built and enabled at city level, alongside an ongoing programme of uptake that Martin can now talk us through.
Many thanks, Sam. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Martin. Please go on.
Yes, great. Thank you very much. I hope to take less than 5 minutes to walk you through our uptake plans. And if Sam was boring with concepts, I hope I will not be too boring with the highly technical concepts, because uptake, I think, is one of the most exciting part of this work. Now, I want to do 2 things. First is to share with you what we think our impact should be with this work, so what we aim to do, and then how we will go about doing that. Overall, and as Diana, I think, has mentioned in the beginning, we hope that our consortia will be able to produce research that can support and galvanize the kind of urban reforms that we aim to get in the cities where we'll be working in the first instance. And then, of course, that research can also then speak to other urban reforms across the continent, and can also be borrowed in other cities with similar context. And, you know, to be able to achieve that, we will be working very strongly to produce robust evidence that can be able to address local research gaps, that can be able to drive urban reforms, and that actually responds to the policy needs in those cities where we will be working. So we will be employing, I think, as Sam was already explained, highly integrated methodologies that ensures that the evidence can be taken up and applied in the cities where we'll be working and in other contexts. The second level of impact where we'll be hoping to achieve is to be able to work with citizens in the cities where we'll be working, to mobilize them and equip them with the necessary knowledge, so that they can use this knowledge to drive the reforms agenda in their areas. So our hope is that our research would be able to speak into the needs of different citizen groups, be they residents associations, be they trade groups, be they networks, and that we will be working very closely with disadvantaged groups so that they can use our evidence to push through the kind of changes that they want to achieve, and to ensure that those changes actually do address their needs and interests. And the third point that we aim to achieve in the level of impact is to live across the continent reform coalitions that are well and better capacitated, and that are able to, organize and in a better way engage with the different professional agencies and government bodies to be able to address urban urban reform issues in their cities. So we'll be working closely with already existing coalitions, and in places where there is opportunity to be able to create new coalitions that can drive this agenda forward. Ultimately, we hope that by bringing in state agencies and government units or city structures that govern the cities where we'll be working, we will enable those cities to grow their capacity, to enhance their capacity to drive the reform agendas in their cities. How will we do this? How will we achieve this kind of impact? I think the first point, Dan already really emphasized this, that the consortia brings together, organizations that have huge experience, both academic and policy, in terms of working with individuals, and in terms of working in cities to address already existing problems. So we think that the way the consortium is structured will allow us to generate the kind of robust evidence needed to address this, but also will tap into the kind of experience that organizations that are already working in these cities bring on board. Beyond the consortium, we will be putting together what I may call a multi-level engagement mechanism that starts with the cities where we will be working. So within the cities where we'll be working, we'll put together engagement structures that ensures that the interests, the research needs, and the policy needs of the different stakeholders at the city level are addressed and are taken into consideration to the level possible during our research. And beyond the cities, we hope that we can then build those engagements moving outwards into the national level and the regional level, and perhaps tapping into the globally available platforms to try and make sure that our research finds its place in different urban reform discussions and discourses at the global level. The objective of doing this, of providing that multi-level engagement structure, is to be able to see that the knowledge that is generated and the experience of the different groups we'll be working with can actually drive the reforms that we want to see. So in these different cities, as I've already said, we'll be working with community organizations, we'll be tapping into the professional associations, and we will be tapping into political leadership, just to make sure that their contribution actually counts. And I think Sam already gave a good example of the work that SDI is doing in Kenya by putting together what they call a special planning in the Mkuru slum, which is one of the biggest slums here in Nairobi. And I think the key thing about the experience SDI or Pascal will be bringing into this is that innovative, flexible approach that ensures that vulnerable groups and community members are part and parcel of the process of reforms and research that we will be doing. And then finally, we will be translating the evidence that we'll be getting into formats that policymakers can be able to use. So across the board, we'll be targeting, for instance, academic journals that are high quality, but also those that address practical issues. So what I may call academic journals, where practitioners and researchers come together to not only use robust methodologies, but also to bring in experiences from practitioners on the ground. And once we've achieved that, then we will be putting together a communication platform that includes a website. Then you can flip into the next slide. A website that different people can have access to the resources and the research that that the consortium will be able to produce. And as you can see on that website, you can hook on onto our Twitter handle, African Cities, the lower iPhone, I think. And also you can be able to reach us through the different platforms that will be made available. So we hope that, this is the beginning of eliciting interest, so that by joining this conversation, you are able to, look forward to the different products that will be coming, and then the engagement process can continue into the future. I believe Chris has put a link to the different communication channels in the chat box. Thank you, Admos.
realize I was muted there. So yeah, I just wanted to thank our presenters, Diana, Sam, and Martin, for walking us through what this research consortium is trying to do. If you want to an easier way of looking at it, you might say Diana told us what they are trying to do. Sam told us how they're going to do it. And Martin has just told us how will we know that this knowledge generated is going to be used to change people's lives in Africa. So thank you for walking us through that. We would like to move straight into the questions. As I said early on, it's preferable if you could type your questions in, but we also welcome people because we would like to hear your voices as well. So where possible, we're going to try and do both. Take the questions when we can see your hand, but also mainly work from the chat. I'm gonna maybe ask 3 questions at a time, so to the panel, and do bear with me. And I hope you can remember the questions, but you can also look in the chat. The first questions are already there. The first one is from Annabelle, who's asking, what was the criteria for selecting the 13 mentioned cities? Was it based on existing partner networks? So that's the first one. The second one from Jen is, how are you aiming to facilitate learning between coalitions, cities that already have good practice or locally derived solutions and processes of change? I will. I think the next issue, the next one from Carol, is just a comment, basically just saying, well, as a principle, I feel that understanding education opportunities and empowerment play a greater role, play a great part in addressing such challenges. This is such a worthwhile research. But I hope that's given you enough time to think through the questions. I'll add a third one from Wendy, which is, yes, Wendy, thank you for reposting it. And Wendy says, thank you for the presentations. Access to reliable, localized data on Africa is a challenge. What is the research consortium's plan on sharing data and research to further increase knowledge dissemination of information? And then related to this question, are there partnerships with local universities and research centers in the initial cities that are part of the consortium? Let's take those 3 questions for a start, and then we'll move on to the rest of, to the other questions. So the first one, Diana, do you want to answer that one? It's saying, what was the criteria for choosing the 13 cities?
Yes, thank you, Admos. It's always a bit hard to realize if I'm muted. I think I'm not muted. So.
You are not muted, Diana, we can hear you.
So the criteria for the cities, which in a way, picks up on the theme, some of the themes that have come out of the other questions. And apologies, I haven't tried to look back at the questions. I see the chat has 67 entries, and I fear I would be lost if I tried to go through them. The original bid had a list of all cities which the UN Population Division estimate to have populations of over 1 million. And the bid documents also challenged the bidders, such as ourselves, to make sure that half their cities were in fragile and conflict-affected states, so as to be relevant in cases of war, conflict, violence. So that was a starting point. I think we teased around for a long time, the partnership, in terms of selecting the cities. So they are ones, for the most part, not entirely, for the most part, where the partners have good contacts or think that there is really interesting work to draw on to address the kinds of challenges that we want to be relevant to. So for the most part, they're strong partnerships. In some cases, the partners recognized that there seemed to be something really interesting about that city. There are, of course, way more than 13 cities with interesting stuff going on in Africa. Really, we are not trying to say that in any sense. We wanted to pick those where we felt that there was a level of interest around thinking about urban problems politically, about thinking about urban solutions in a way that was integrated, and about recognizing that advancing knowledge that was relevant would include both the best academic thinking, but also new professional practices, engagements with organized communities, reaching out to a wide range of citizens, stakeholders who wanted something better. So we saw these cities as cities which had some of that potential. We absolutely, I'm sure, will find in maybe 3-4 years, we'll be kicking ourselves because we missed out on a city where there is really interesting stuff going on. But we did the best that we could. I would just maybe make a couple of other comments that seem to me to relate also to that choice of cities. So in a sense, we see cities where there's some emerging possibility of practices that are absolutely worth sharing and building and learning on. And we see those practices as partly, at least partly, embedded in local processes of change. So I think in terms of, I think Jen's question, we saw both things as important. And sorry, I would just also, sorry, I know we should get on to other questions, but we did also see that academic thinking, engagement with the local universities was indeed going to be a critical move for, a critical thing that we needed to take on going forward.
Thank you, Diana. Sam and Martin, do you want to add anything to that?
Just briefly, that we also selected the cities to try and reflect a broad range of political settlement types. So somewhere they're unsettled, somewhere power is concentrated, Zimbabwe, Uganda, and somewhere power is very dispersed, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Malawi, and so on. So, and that's not just academic. We wanted to try and understand whether different types of solutions, different types of reform coalition had more or less traction in different types of political settlement.
Thank you, Sam. Martin, anything to add?
No, Admos.
Okay, moving on to the question from Jen. So are you aiming to facilitate learning between coalitions, cities that already have good practice or locally derived solutions and processes of change? I think, Diana, you did touch a little bit in your response to the first one. You did touch on that, but can you be more focused on this one and respond more directly among the three of you?
Maybe Martin or Sam would like to start on this one.
Sam, do you want to start? Martin? Okay. Diana, do you want to go?
Okay. So as I was trying to say, I think that I'm sure we will pick up practices that we know about already and practices where there is a real interest in engaging through research in identifying how to sharpen those practices. And the sharpening of those practices will involve comparative research. So will involve learning from one place in another place, will involve researchers and non-researchers, non-academic researchers in sharing experiences, experiential learning, and really working out what they think is going on and how those solutions can emerge that are going to be stronger than the ones already in place. So we have a very locally embedded strategy. We really don't think, in our experience, that solutions can be parachuted in from outside. They need to be tested with a local process of change, but we are also conscious from our experience that those local change processes are often catalyzed by useful experiences outside the city. And in some cases, they're catalyzed because processes are stuck, sometimes for political contestation reasons of political contestation, sometimes just because a problem is seen so overwhelming. And when those problems are stuck, sometimes a good idea from outside can be very useful in unsticking them. Sometimes it's not really that the process is stuck so much as a very strong set of political interests are blocking progress. And in that case, we aspire to produce knowledge that helps unblock that. We will seek to provide evidence from that city or location, but also from elsewhere, that encourages people to think differently about the place that they're at and the options that they're looking at. And I think our experience is that, we have some experience which has shown how to do that successfully. Let me just say that.
Thank you, Diana. The last question among the first three is to do with your plan for sharing data and research to further increase knowledge dissemination. Related to this, and this is a question from Wendy, related to this question, are there partnerships with local universities and research centers in the initial cities that are part of the consortium? So I think these are two parts of the question. Maybe the first part, I could try and throw it to Martin. Do you want to, because it's also related to uptake in some ways. Martin, do you want to have a go first? How do you plan on sharing data or the findings of your research to increase knowledge dissemination, given the constraints which you know exist in many parts of Africa related to dissemination of information?
I am Admos.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, okay. So I'm sure my colleague Chris will also speak to this, but I think one of the things that we intend to do is to provide a platform where the different pieces of evidence generated in this work can be openly accessed across the continent. So the program will have a program website, which we hope can be accessible across the board. The second thing is, I think the different consortium partners, most of them based across the continent, we will tap into their networks to be able to share the evidence across these African cities. So one of the questions which was asked is whether we hope to facilitate coalition learning. I think this is one of the ways we'll be able to do this. For instance, if you look at the work that SDI is doing across the continent, or PASCA is doing across the continent, PASCA works with about 16 or 20 African universities, which is part of its network. And therefore, by being part of this consortium, we will be, in a way, opening up the consortium with those 16 African universities, not only to learn from what's going on here, but also to tap into the already resources that they have. But in terms of sharing data, I think Chris might be able to speak a little bit more to this.
Yes, before I come to Chris, just want to check that Diana and Sam, you don't want to add anything else to that. I just want to give Chris time to think.
Just very quickly, yeah, I mean, sharing the knowledge, sharing the data is a really critical part of this throughout. So both the process, the issues that we're grappling with as we go along, and the final reports, the final evidence. And so we'll be investing in that both through the kind of secretariat that's based in Manchester, which will make it all available digitally. But also, as Martin has said, in the cities themselves, having locally embedded people who can do the convening work and the communications work and act as brokers between local community groups and policy actors. And so it's not just about making the data available, it's about doing it in a way that's going to be useful and helpful and push reform coalitions forward.
Okay. Thank you for that. Anything to add, Diana, Sam?
Not from my side.
Okay.
I would maybe, Sam, I think we'll try and build on ECID's best practice in terms of open access books, etc. Did you want to briefly reference that?
I've had my head down responding to questions in the chat, so I may have missed Chris's numbers. But yeah, I think we're fully committed to the widest possible sharing of this, and I think it's not just because because it makes our work more relevant to policy actors, but as part of a wider attempt to democratise knowledge. And Diana and others within ACRC are intensely committed to the democratisation of knowledge production. There's been a number of questions about who should be in charge of work in African cities that I think are very well taken within the centre. We got the money because of the ways in which development research funding operates, but we very much hope to use ACRC as a means of handing over to the next generation of urban researchers who obviously based in African cities. So we do see that as being fundamental to our agenda, to go back to a couple of questions in the chat and that have come up.
Okay, thank you, Sam, for that. I see we've got quite a lot of questions here, some which are related, but there's one which is a clarification. How do you plan on whittling down the cities from 13 to 8?
Should I have a go at that one? We are aware it's going to be intensely political because so we plan to develop the criteria that we will use at an early stage. So we have agreement on the criteria to use. The challenge is to identify cities in which we can really get an interest among the city and potentially national elites. I mean, Sam particularly talked a bit about how we recognize the significance of national elites. So we need to get those guys to buy into the reforms which people who are more disadvantaged and those concerned about economic opportunities that they have been excluded from advancing, those reforms that we want to push forward. So it will be, I think, almost certainly tricky. I think the advantage still of working with a reasonably large number is that we won't be hostage to any one of those locations, but we can really work with emerging with groups that in most cases are already established and those that we've been able to successfully strengthen, who can manage to negotiate a way through local obstacles to demonstrate new ways of doing things. So we recognize the challenges and that's how we're going to try and crack it.
Yes, and there's a question here which is it's almost like a running theme now. You've chosen these large cities which you think are more interesting in your words, but some people, there's questions here about there's also a lot of smaller cities which also have got common problems but are also quite interesting, and you're being challenged there to think outside the box and see value in studying those as well in future.
Maybe shall I jump in on that one?
Yeah.
I mean, Admos is smiling because it's a long-standing point of discussion between Admos and myself. So we recognize that there are many, many smaller cities. We recognize that there are big urban needs in secondary and tertiary cities. We have picked some of our 13 cities that are a little bit smaller than others, but they are all major conurbations. We recognize that. We also recognize that, just as Sam said, that we're going to try and understand systems in cities, that cities are embedded in urban systems, that the way in which a big city functions is related to the functioning of smaller cities on its periphery, or those which it has strong connections to, i.e. important roads. So we've recognized that one of the constraints of this research consortium is that we are limited in how we are addressing the needs of smaller urban centers. We are not saying in any sense that they are not significant. We are just saying that this opportunity offered an exciting chance to advance knowledge that we are deeply committed to advancing. So we dwelt on the possibilities rather than the constraints in the program design.
Yes, thank you, Diana. There's a question here. I think, Sam, what form, if any, of engagement or impact are envisioned in terms of the national political settlements, or is that just an underlying theoretical lens for understanding more localized phenomena? So while Sam, while you're thinking about answering those, I want to pick up another one from Tim, which says, are all solutions focused, put forward within the urban space? I think this question is, do you see any connections between the work you're doing and the peri-urban and rural?
So maybe briefly on that one, while Sam is gearing up to the way more tricky one. We are indeed interested in looking at some relationships between the areas immediately outside the city and some of the peri-urban areas. One of the areas that we flagged to do more work on, for example, is nutrition and food markets related to nutrition. So we do recognize the importance of some of those interconnections. Thank
you. Sam, do you want to have a go on that?
Yeah, I had a brief go in the chat, but I think, you know, the political settlements is the context. It's part of the structural context within which this African cities exist, and we don't assume that we will be able to shift those. I think the challenge is to make sure to craft workable solutions that are feasible, politically feasible within them. And we think that the best of those will end up changing ideas and potentially building up new capabilities that may progressively shift the broader balance of power by making previously irrelevant groups more relevant, and to which political elites have to respond to. But that's going to be a much longer term process than a 6-year research consortium. So we don't presume that we can shift structures here so much as make sure that our work is relevant to them and feasible within them, I think.
Thank you. I know we're running a little bit over time. I'm gonna maybe just throw in the last 2 questions and hope that our panelists also look in the chat and respond to the questions. But I want to pick up the next question from Sue, which is, this is a large, well-resourced program. How do you plan to interface with existing researchers on African cities who are not part of this project? And while we are thinking that on the response to that, I'll also finish with a question from Vincent. This is a great initiative and thanks for the presentations. Where is the position of citizens in this research in terms of frameworks and implementations? So I think I'm gonna throw that open to you, but part of the last question, I think Martin can respond to. So do you want to have a go on Sue's question?
Let me start on Sue's question. I think the simple answer is that we're working it out in part, that we wish to reach out to obviously existing researchers who are doing work that we feel is complementary to the work that we are doing. We recognize, of course, that large this may be, but it clearly is, there's still a lot that other work that needs to be done. So we're looking absolutely at complementarities. We're also looking to particularly support early career researchers and looking at ways in which they can engage with the work that we're doing, the frameworks that we're using, and find ways to both engage with them, but also make them their own, in a sense, build in their own trajectory, their own career trajectories to what we're trying to do. And then I think, as we've already talked about, we're trying to reach out particularly to African researchers within our cities that we hope to work with very closely around some of the more immediate research processes. So we have had some discussions around that, and we are still trying to finalize plans at this stage.
Thank you, Diana, for that response. And the last maybe question, the position of citizens in this research.
Yeah, I mean, I think, go on, Martin, after you.
Yes.
Martin,
Sorry,
you have to go and then Sam will finish off, yes.
Yes, I was actually going to hope that Diana was going to jump into trying to answer that. I think my immediate thoughts about that is that, you know, there is so much that a research project can do to involve citizens, or everyday wananchi, as we call them in Kenya, in a research process. What we aim to do as a consortium actually is to try and ensure that the voices of citizens are part and parcel of this. And so the kind of methodologies I think that we'll be adopting will be such that the citizens are accompanying the research, if I may use that word, rather than being sources of just the evidence. Now, in the engagement processes, we hope to be able to use various mechanisms and approaches that allows the citizens to, you know, to actually contribute to the research process. And it's our hope that by doing that, they will be able to start using the evidence generated in our research to begin building the kind of reforms that we hope to achieve. But that said, I think I have to emphasize that already some of the organizations we'll be working with who are part of the consortia are already engaging citizens directly in their work. And therefore, we hope that those platforms will be enhanced in the process.
Thank you. Sam, do you want to add that? And then we'll probably finish off with Diana, some last words from you.
Just briefly, in terms of implementation, I think our intention of working with reform coalitions, which would play a strong role for citizen-led organisations, is really key, particularly to phase 3. In terms of the frameworks, I think what a political settlements analysis does is maybe get us a little bit beyond the slightly romantic sense that urban citizens can solve all problems by themselves, and links up citizens to other forms of political subjectivity in terms of often being treated as clients, and also to broader strategies of elite accumulation and survival, which actually make it very difficult to enact autonomous forms of citizenship. And so we put that somewhat hopeful world, if you like, of social movement activism into play with a somewhat more realist frame of analysis. And we hope that both benefit from that. But I think it's a really good question, and it's that's how we're starting off. Where we land, we'll have to see.
Yes, thank you, Sam. And Diana, and then we'll wrap things up.
So I feel I should have thought, Admos, about some final words that would close it down. And I haven't thought about them, so this is a bit ad hoc. I really want to thank you all for your engagement. We will look back at the chat. I am, Sam, filled with your admiration from your ability to answer, chat and participate in the discussion. I saw myself as being skilled in multitasking, but I haven't even attempted that. I would like, I think, to reflect perhaps on the challenge that we face. So I started by talking a little bit about the opportunity that we saw. And I think Sam and Martin gave substance to the opportunity that I framed. I think we're very aware that, you know, considerable skills, capabilities, great minds have already thought about the challenges that we aspire to work on. And we have got to be modest because we recognize that they are not easy challenges. What we will really do along the lines that we've outlined is try and push forward the frontiers of knowledge, sharing whatever we do, both because we believe in the democratization of knowledge, but also because we are seeking to lay foundations for an emerging generation of scholars and non-academic scholars, knowledge generators that we feel will be in a good position to take forward our work and develop new trajectories of development in urban Africa. So we have got to end, I think, with a recognition that we have got to be modest. This is very tricky. What is on our side is that we are working with some amazing people. The challenges that we face are considerable for the reasons that the participants have identified. So really, I would just like to end, I think, by saying thank you to all of you. Thank you, Martin and Sam, for your contributions. It's really been wonderful already working with you. I look forward to many years. Admos, I'm only regretful that I could not tempt you more away from your rural interests into the urban sphere, but I live in hope.
Thank you, Diana. And on that note, I just want to also say my last words as someone who's been chairing this webinar, just to thank you all for joining us for this discussion. It's been an afternoon where you've really interacted with us. I've just been looking at the chat and seeing that it was quite active. I would like to encourage you to see this as the beginning of a journey of our relationship here at GDI with you. So continue to follow the research as it develops. You've seen it start, so you should also try and continue to help this develop and deliver improved lives for people who live in urban Africa. If you want to follow us, I've asked Chris to put the slide again. You can see there that you can still follow us via Twitter. And it's very important that we also know what your thoughts are. We will take a look at the chat, and if we'll also use that to help us to think through the research as it develops. Otherwise, on that note, from wherever you are, I would like to thank you for joining us and hope to see you again for our next event, which will be advertised. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.